A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You know, Herman, I was looking at the calendar this morning and realized our executive producer, young Ezra, is about to hit the 9-month milestone. It feels like just yesterday we were talking about him being a tiny sensory sponge, and now he is basically a mobile unit with his own agenda. This is a massive system update for the entire production team. We are moving out of the early deployment phase and into something much more high frequency and, frankly, a bit more chaotic.
It is wild how fast the version numbers increment at this stage. We are witnessing the transition from a relatively predictable infant architecture to a pre-toddler phase that is defined by high-frequency iteration. Today's prompt from Daniel is actually about this exact transition. He is looking for a bit of a roadmap for what he and Hannah should expect over the next few months, specifically regarding this intense period of developmental volatility and where it all eventually levels out into a more stable operating system.
It is a great question because, from the outside, it looks like a total chaotic explosion of new features. One week he is sitting there looking at a block, and the next week he is trying to dismantle the television stand. I want to dig into that shift from the passive observer phase to what feels like active environmental manipulation. Why does 9 months feel like the moment the lights finally come on in the cockpit?
That is a perfect way to frame it. If you remember back in episode 646, we talked about the mouth as a scanner. That was the phase where Ezra was basically just intake, intake, intake. He was using his mouth and his eyes to build a low-resolution map of the world. But at 9 months, the firmware update is all about interaction. We are moving from the intake phase to the testing phase. The primary difference is the introduction of independent mobility. Once a child starts crawling or cruising, they are no longer dependent on the data that is brought to them. They can go out and fetch their own data. This creates a massive feedback loop that accelerates every other system in the brain.
So he is basically moving from a read-only database to a read-write system. He is not just observing the environment, he is actively trying to change the state of the objects within it.
Precisely. Well, not precisely, but you get the idea. At 9 months, we see the convergence of a few major systems. You have the motor skills coming online with crawling and cruising, which provides a massive influx of new spatial data. But the real heavy lifter here is the cognitive shift toward complex object permanence and goal-directed behavior. This is the period where the brain starts to understand that the world has a persistent state, even when that state is not being directly observed by the primary sensors.
I have seen that object permanence thing in action. It is like they finally realized that when you hide the remote behind your back, it has not actually ceased to exist in this dimension. It is just hidden. But I noticed there is a lag there, right? They do not get it perfectly on the first try.
You were talking about the A not B error. It is a classic developmental milestone. If you hide a toy under box A several times, the 9-month-old will find it. But if you then hide it under box B right in front of them, they will often still look under box A. Their brain is still hard-coding the association between the action of reaching and the reward, rather than fully grasping the independent trajectory of the object. Overcoming that error over the next 3 months is a massive computational leap. It is the beginning of working memory. Ezra has to hold an image of that toy in his head while he actively moves his body to go find it. That is a massive computational load for a 9-month-old brain. It is why we see so much volatility. The system is constantly crashing because it is trying to run too many new processes at once.
Let us talk about that volatility for a second. Daniel asked about when the trajectory begins to stabilize. Right now, it feels like every single month is a brand new person. Is there a reason the growth is so non-linear at this stage? Why can it not just be a steady 5% improvement every month instead of these massive spikes and plateaus where he learns 3 things in a weekend and then does nothing for 3 weeks?
It comes down to synaptic density and the metabolic cost of growth. Right now, Ezra's brain is in a state of absolute overgrowth. Between birth and age 2, the human brain creates way more synapses than it will ever actually use. We call this synaptogenesis. It is like building a massive, sprawling city with 10 times as many roads as you need just to see which routes people actually take. Because the infrastructure is so dense and interconnected, a small change in one area, like learning to crawl, can trigger a cascade of developments in spatial reasoning, depth perception, and even social communication. The volatility is a feature, not a bug. It is the system exploring the entire state space of what it means to be human.
So the volatility is a byproduct of the system being over-engineered for learning. It is like he has too much RAM and the OS is just trying to find a way to use it all.
It is the most efficient way to handle an unknown environment. If you do not know if you are going to grow up in a desert, a city, or on a farm, you build a brain that can adapt to anything. But that means the system is highly sensitive to input. One day he figures out that dropping a spoon makes a loud noise, and suddenly he is running a physics simulation 40 times a day. That is a new rule added to his world model, and it happens overnight. But this level of growth is unsustainable. At 9 months, a baby's brain is consuming about 50 to 60% of their total resting metabolic energy. Think about that. Over half of every calorie Ezra eats is going straight to powering those neural connections. You cannot maintain that level of high-frequency iteration forever.
I imagine that is exhausting for the parents too. You just get used to the rules of month 8, and then month 9 arrives and throws the rule book out the window. When does that actually slow down? When do we get to a version of Ezra that stays relatively consistent for more than 4 weeks? Daniel and Hannah are looking for that light at the end of the tunnel where they do not have to relearn their son's personality every Tuesday.
The first major stabilization plateau usually starts to emerge around 18 to 24 months. That is when we move from what I call the alpha phase into the beta phase. By the time a child hits 2 years old, the brain starts a massive process called developmental pruning. It realizes it does not need all those extra roads we talked about. It starts cutting the connections that are not being used and strengthening the ones that are through a process called myelination, which is basically adding insulation to the wires to make them faster and more efficient.
So it is an optimization pass. The brain is moving from a general-purpose processor to an application-specific integrated circuit.
The brain moves from being a generalist to being a specialist. As those pathways solidify, the month-to-month changes become less about foundational architecture and more about feature refinement. Between 9 and 12 months, you might see a child go from sitting still to walking. That is a massive, foundational leap in how the unit interacts with gravity and three-dimensional space. Between age 4 and 5, the changes are still significant, but they are more incremental. You are not fundamentally changing how the unit moves through space anymore. You are just refining the coordination and adding higher-level logic.
It is interesting to think about that pruning process as the beginning of stability. It almost sounds like we become more predictable as we become more efficient. We lose some of that raw chaotic potential in exchange for being able to actually function in the world without crashing. But looking at the next 3 months specifically for Daniel and Hannah, what are the breaking changes they should be looking for? If 9 months is the start of this window, what does the lead up to the first birthday look like in terms of the actual user experience?
The big one is the transition from accidental discovery to intentionality. At 9 months, a lot of what they do is still a bit of a fluke. They might hit a button and music plays, and they look surprised. By month 12, they are hitting that button because they want the music. This shift toward goal-directed behavior is the precursor to everything else, including language. You will also see the emergence of joint attention. This is when Ezra starts looking at what you are looking at. If Daniel points at a dog, Ezra will look at the dog, then back at Daniel to confirm they are both processing the same data point. This is a massive upgrade in the communication protocol. It is the beginning of shared reality.
Does language follow that same volatility curve? Because I know some kids just start talking in full sentences one day, while others take a more linear path. It feels like language is the ultimate black box for parents.
Language is actually a great example of the S-curve of development. You have this long tail of very little output where the child is just absorbing phonemes and syntax. That is the 9 to 12 month window. They might have a couple of words, maybe mama or dada, but mostly they are just listening. They are filling up the buffer. Then, usually around 18 months, you hit the vertical part of the S-curve. It is often called the vocabulary explosion. They might go from 10 words to 50 words in a matter of weeks. It is a nonlinear jump that happens once the underlying neural architecture for symbolic representation is stable enough to support it.
It is like a buffer filling up. You do not see anything on the screen for a long time, and then suddenly the whole video plays at once. But that lag must be frustrating for the kid.
It is incredibly frustrating. This is why parents often feel like nothing is happening, and then they wake up one day and the kid is a different person. For Daniel and Hannah, the next few months will likely be characterized by a lot of frustration on Ezra's part. His desire to interact with the world is starting to outpace his physical ability to do so. He has the intent, but the hardware is still lagging.
The classic bottleneck problem. The processor is fast, but the peripherals are still on a legacy connection. He is trying to run a high-speed simulation on a dial-up modem.
He wants to reach the cat, but his legs only move him in circles. He wants to tell you he is hungry for a specific thing, but he only has one sound for, I want something. That gap between cognitive intent and physical execution is where a lot of the emotional volatility comes from. This is the era of the proto-tantrum. It is not defiance, it is just a system error caused by a lack of bandwidth. But as he hits that stabilization point around age 2, the peripherals start to catch up. The gait becomes more stable, the fine motor skills allow for better manipulation, and the language allows for actual negotiation. The volatility recedes because the gap between what he wants to do and what he can do begins to narrow.
You mentioned the arc of growth toward adulthood earlier. If we look at this as a long-term system, how does this volatility look over the span of 20 years? Does it just keep dampening down until we are boring adults who never change? Or are there other spikes we should be worried about?
It is more like a series of waves. You have this massive spike in infancy and toddlerhood, then a relatively stable period in middle childhood, what we often call the latency period. That is when the brain is doing a lot of formal learning and social integration. The architecture is mostly set and you are just installing applications. Then you hit puberty and the whole system goes back into a high volatility state. It is like a second infancy in terms of neural reorganization.
Oh, great. So Ezra is going to be a stable system for a few years, and then the hormones are going to come in like a chaotic software patch that breaks all the legacy drivers.
It is actually a second period of massive synaptic pruning. The prefrontal cortex, which handles executive function, impulse control, and risk assessment, goes through a total overhaul. It is the last part of the brain to be fully myelinated. So you have this high volatility in the early years where you are building the basic human operating system. Stability in the middle, where you are adding data, and then another high volatility period in the teens where you are upgrading to the adult enterprise edition. The brain literally detaches some of its control systems to rewire them for higher complexity.
And after that, once we hit our mid-20s and the prefrontal cortex is finally finished, is that the end of the volatility? Do we just plateau forever?
For the most part, yes. The month-to-month changes become almost imperceptible. You might learn a new skill or change a habit, but your foundational architecture is set. This is why childhood development is so fascinating. It is the only time in your life where you are fundamentally a different biological entity every few months. By the time you are 30, you are basically running on the same hardware and OS for decades, just doing minor security updates.
It makes me think about how we track all this. In episode 440, we talked about moving beyond the diaper log and not getting bogged down in every single data point. Given what we know about this 9-month volatility, how should Daniel and Hannah be looking at progress? Should they even be looking at a month-to-month scale, or is that still too granular? If the system is this chaotic, does a daily log even make sense?
At this stage, month-to-month is still very relevant, but you have to look at it through the lens of system stability rather than just a checklist of milestones. Instead of asking, can he do X yet, ask how is he integrating his new skills? Is he using his crawling to get to his toys? Is he using his voice to get attention? You are looking for the emergence of a cohesive personality that can navigate the environment. The data points matter less than the trend line of intentionality. If you focus too much on the individual metrics, you will drive yourself crazy because of the regressions.
I like that. It is less about the individual features and more about the integration tests. Does the whole system work together to achieve a goal? But you mentioned regressions. That seems like a big source of stress for parents. Why does a kid suddenly forget how to do something they mastered last week?
Because the brain only has so much energy to allocate to these massive upgrades. If Ezra is working on a major motor milestone like pulling to stand, his brain is dedicating massive amounts of neural real estate to balance and coordination. It is totally normal for language or sleep to take a back seat during that sprint. Once the new motor skill is merged into the main branch and becomes automatic, those resources are freed up again. A regression is not a failure of the system, it is just a resource reallocation. The dev team moved all the engineers to the graphics engine for a week, so the server stability took a hit.
That is an important point for parents to hear. It is not a step backward, it is just a pivot in focus. So, what does the sandbox look like for a 9-month-old? If we want to support this transition from passive to active, how do we build an environment that rewards this new intentionality without it being a constant source of danger?
It is all about feedback loops and affordances. At this age, Ezra needs an environment that responds to his actions in predictable ways. This is the concept of high quality data. If he pushes a ball, it rolls. If he drops a block, it thuds. If he makes a specific sound, Hannah or Daniel responds. This is how he builds his internal model of cause and effect. The more consistent the feedback, the faster he can refine his predictions. You want to provide a low entropy environment. If the world is too chaotic or unresponsive, the learning slows down because the patterns are harder to find.
It is like training a model. You need high quality, consistent data to minimize the loss function. If the environment is too noisy, the model cannot converge on a solution.
That is why routines are so helpful, even if they feel boring to us. They provide a stable baseline that allows the child to notice the small variations. If the operating environment is consistent, Ezra can focus all his processing power on the new variables he is testing that day. If the schedule is always changing and the environment is unpredictable, he has to spend too much energy just trying to figure out the baseline, which leaves less for the high-level developmental work.
I want to go back to the idea of the stabilization plateau. You said 18 to 24 months is when the month-to-month changes start to feel less drastic. Is that because the physical growth slows down, or is it purely a cognitive thing?
It is both. Physical growth actually follows a similar curve. You have this massive doubling and tripling of weight in the first year, which then slows down significantly. But the cognitive side is really about that pruning we mentioned. Once the brain has decided on its primary languages, its primary motor patterns, and its primary social strategies, it stops being so plastic. It becomes more efficient, which means it is less prone to sudden, radical shifts. It is the trade-off between flexibility and power. A 9-month-old is infinitely flexible but not very powerful. An adult is very powerful and efficient but not very flexible.
That is a profound way to look at it. We start as a cloud of infinite potential and slowly collapse into a specific, highly functional individual. The volatility Daniel is seeing right now is just the sound of that potential being sorted through. It is the most intense learning period Ezra will ever experience.
It really is. It puts our adult productivity into perspective. We get excited about learning a new software tool over a weekend, while Ezra is literally learning how to be a three-dimensional object in a gravity well. He is learning the fundamental laws of physics, the nuances of human social interaction, and the mechanics of his own body all at the same time.
When you put it that way, it is a miracle we get anything done as adults. We are just living off the interest of the massive investments we made in our first 2 years.
In many ways, we are. The foundational concepts of space, time, causality, and social reciprocity are all forged in this high volatility furnace. By the time you are 3 or 4, you are just building on top of those foundations. The breaking changes are mostly over. You are in the long tail of refinement.
So, for Daniel and Hannah, the next few months are basically the peak of the storm. It is going to be fast, it is going to be messy, and it is going to be unpredictable. But by the time Ezra is hitting his second birthday, they will start to see the person he is becoming in a much more stable way. The frequency of the updates will slow down, but the quality of the features will go up.
That is the light at the end of the tunnel. But I would also encourage them to enjoy the volatility. There is something incredibly beautiful about watching a human brain rewrite its own rules in real time. You will never again see such a pure expression of curiosity and adaptation. Once the system stabilizes, it is more reliable, but it loses some of that magic of discovery. You do not see an adult get excited because they figured out how a door hinge works.
Unless that adult is you, Herman. I have seen you spend 20 minutes looking at a door hinge.
Guilty as charged. But honestly, even for a donkey who reads a lot of papers, the 9-month mark is special. It is the birth of the will. It is the moment when the child stops being something that happens to the world and starts being someone who happens to the world. Ezra is moving from a passenger to a driver, even if he is currently driving a very small wobbly car with no brakes.
And he is going to crash that car into a lot of things over the next few months. But that is how he learns where the walls are. He needs those collisions to map the boundaries of his reality.
And for the parents, the job is just to make sure the walls are padded and the feedback is consistent. If they can do that, the system will handle the rest. The human brain is the most sophisticated self-optimizing system in existence. It knows what it needs to do.
Speaking of learning where the walls are, we should probably start wrapping this up before we go down a rabbit hole of adolescent neurobiology. We have covered the 9-month update, the volatility of the over-engineered brain, and the eventual stabilization that comes with synaptic pruning.
It is a lot to process. But the main takeaway for the production team is that the next 3 to 6 months are going to be a high-frequency iteration phase. Expect feature creep in every department from mobility to vocalization.
And maybe a few more emergency patches for the sleep schedule.
Almost certainly. But that is the price of progress. Every time the brain does a major hardware upgrade, the power management system takes a hit.
Well, I feel like I have a much better handle on why our executive producer is acting the way he is. It is not chaos. It is just a very intense development cycle. It is a good reminder to be patient with the hardware. It is doing its best with the drivers it has.
Always. And the drivers are getting better every day. By the time he is 2, he will be running a much more stable build.
Before we sign off, I want to give a huge thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumentop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes while we analyze the gears turning in Ezra's head.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the complex simulations we run to make this show possible.
If you want to dig into our archives on child development, from sensory scanners to screen time, head over to myweirdprompts.com. We have over 1,100 episodes covering everything from AI to anatomy.
You can also find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your audio fix.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We will see you next time.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts.